The summer heat hung heavy over the small town of Millbrook, a quiet place where everyone knew everyone and secrets traveled faster than the morning breeze. It was the kind of town where children rode their bicycles until the streetlights came on, where neighbors borrowed sugar and returned it with freshly baked cookies, and where life moved at a pace that the big cities had long forgotten. But beneath this peaceful surface, like in every small town, there were stories that people whispered about but never spoke openly. Marcus Webb was one of those stories. He was 23 years old, the son of Richard Webb, the wealthiest man in 3 counties. The Webb family owned the lumber mill that employed half the town, the shopping center on Main Street, and more land than anyone could walk across in a single day. Richard Webb had built his empire from nothing, starting as a simple carpenter and working his way up until he could buy the very company that once employed him. People respected Richard, feared him a little, and depended on him for their livelihoods. But Marcus was different from his father. Where Richard had earned everything through sweat and sacrifice, Marcus had been handed everything on a silver platter. He had never worked a day in his life, never known what it felt like to worry about paying bills or putting food on the table. He drove a sports car that cost more than most houses in Millbrook, wore clothes shipped from designers in Milan and Paris, and treated the town like his personal playground. The problem was not just that Marcus was spoiled. The problem was that Marcus was cruel. From the time he was a young boy, Marcus had discovered that his family's money made him untouchable. When he was 8, he had pushed a smaller boy into the mud at school and laughed while the boy cried. The boy's parents had complained, but a generous donation to the school's library fund had made the complaint disappear. When he was 12, he had stolen a bicycle from another child simply because he wanted it. The police had come, but Richard Webb had written a check, and suddenly the bicycle had been a gift, not a theft. When he was 16, Marcus had crashed his car into a fence belonging to an elderly widow, destroying her garden that she had tended for 40 years. Richard had paid for a new fence and a new garden, but no one could pay for the tears the old woman had shed over her roses. Year after year, incident after incident, Marcus learned a simple lesson. Money could fix anything. Money could silence complaints, erase mistakes, and turn victims into people who smiled and said nothing was wrong. Money was power, and power meant he could do whatever he wanted. By the time Marcus reached his 20s, he had become something that the town spoke about only in whispers. He had a group of friends, though they were not really friends. They were hangers-on, people who laughed at his jokes because he paid for their drinks, who followed him around because he had a big house with a swimming pool, who pretended to like him because they hoped some of his money might fall their way. They called themselves a crew, but really they were just an audience for Marcus's cruelty. There was Danny, a former high school football player whose dreams of college sports had ended with a knee injury. Now he worked at a gas station and spent his evenings drinking beer that Marcus bought. There was Tyler, a thin young man with nervous eyes who agreed with everything Marcus said and laughed too loud at his jokes. And there was Brett, the biggest of them all, a man who had spent time in jail for assault and who served as Marcus's unofficial bodyguard. Together, they roamed the town looking for entertainment, which usually meant looking for trouble. On the other side of Millbrook, in a small house with peeling paint and a garden that struggled against the poor soil, lived Daniel Morrison. He was also 23, the same age as Marcus, but the 2 young men could not have been more different. Daniel had grown up knowing what it meant to go without. His father had left when Daniel was 5 years old, disappearing one night and never returning. His mother, Sarah, had raised him alone, working double shifts at the diner on the edge of town, her hands growing rough from washing dishes and her feet aching from standing on concrete floors for 12 hours at a time. She never complained, never cried in front of her son, but Daniel knew. He saw the way she counted coins at the end of the month, the way she gave him the bigger portion at dinner while claiming she was not hungry, the way she wore the same coat for 10 winters because there was never money for a new one. Daniel had learned early that the world was not fair. Some people were born into warmth and plenty, while others had to fight for every scrap. But his mother had taught him something else too. She had taught him that a person's worth was not measured by the size of their house or the number in their bank account. It was measured by how they treated others, by the kindness they showed, by the strength of their character when life pushed them down. So Daniel had worked hard. He had been a good student, not brilliant but determined, staying up late to study while other kids played video games. He had taken jobs where he could find them, mowing lawns, shoveling snow, bagging groceries at the supermarket. Every dollar he earned, he gave half to his mother and saved the other half in a jar hidden under his bed. When Daniel was 18, something unexpected had happened. A military recruiter had come to his high school, setting up a table in the gymnasium with brochures and videos showing soldiers in crisp uniforms, standing tall and proud. Daniel had stopped by the table, curious, and the recruiter had talked to him for an hour. The recruiter had spoken about discipline, about purpose, about becoming part of something bigger than yourself. He had talked about the opportunity to serve, to protect, to make a difference. That night, Daniel had told his mother about the conversation. Sarah had sat quietly, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes glistening with tears she refused to let fall. She knew what this meant. Her son would leave, would go far away, might be sent to dangerous places. Every mother's nightmare. But she also knew her son. She knew that he needed this, needed to find his own path, needed to become the man she had always known he could be. 2 months after graduation, Daniel had left Millbrook. He had hugged his mother on the porch of their little house, holding her tight, breathing in the scent of her hair that smelled like the diner's coffee and something floral from her cheap shampoo. She had whispered that she was proud of him, so proud, and that he should remember who he was no matter where the world took him. The years that followed had changed Daniel in ways he could not have imagined. Basic training had been brutal, pushing him beyond what he thought were his limits, teaching him that the mind could convince the body to do impossible things. He had learned to shoot, to march, to follow orders, and eventually to give them. He had been stationed overseas, seen things that would stay with him forever, lost friends who had become brothers. He had held a dying man's hand in a dusty village far from home, promising to tell his wife that he loved her. A promise he had kept 6 months later when he stood on a doorstep in Ohio and watched a woman's world collapse. But Daniel had also found something in those years. He had found himself. The quiet, uncertain boy who had left Millbrook had become something else. He had become a man who knew what he was capable of, who had been tested by fire and had not broken. He had developed a stillness inside, a calm center that nothing could shake. He had seen the worst of humanity, but he had also seen the best, the courage, the sacrifice, the love that people showed when everything was falling apart. When Daniel's service ended, he had returned home briefly, sleeping in his old room with the faded posters on the walls, eating his mother's cooking, which still tasted like love made solid. Sarah had noticed the change in her son. He still smiled, still laughed, but there was something in his eyes now, a depth that had not been there before. He moved differently too, always aware of his surroundings, always positioned so he could see the door. Daniel had not planned to stay in Millbrook. The town felt smaller than he remembered, the streets narrower, the horizons closer. But then an opportunity had come that he could not refuse. A friend from his unit, a man named Thomas who had served with Daniel in some of the worst places on earth, had reached out with a job offer. Thomas now worked in security, high-level protection for important people, and he was putting together a team. The job was overseas in a country Daniel had never been to but had heard of all his life. It was a posting that most security professionals could only dream of, a position that required the highest levels of skill, discipline, and discretion. Thomas wanted Daniel to join the Royal Guard. The idea had seemed impossible at first. Daniel, a kid from a rundown house in a small American town, guarding royalty? But Thomas had explained that the world of security was changing. They needed people with real experience, people who had proven themselves in actual combat, not just ceremonial soldiers who looked good in photographs. The position paid well, very well, enough that Daniel could send money home to his mother every month and still save for a future he was only beginning to imagine. After 2 weeks of consideration, Daniel had accepted. The training for the Royal Guard had been intense, different from military training but building on everything Daniel had learned. He had studied protocols and procedures, learned to identify threats in crowded spaces, practiced formations and responses until they became muscle memory. He had learned about the royal family he would be protecting, their histories and habits, their routines and vulnerabilities. He had been fitted for the famous uniform, the red coat and tall bearskin hat that tourists photographed from around the world. On his first day of actual duty, Daniel had stood outside the palace gates, motionless, expressionless, while hundreds of people walked past. Some tried to make him laugh, pulling faces or telling jokes. Others posed for photographs, throwing their arms around him like he was a statue. A few touched him, poked him, even insulted him. Through it all, Daniel remained still. He was not just a guard, not just a symbol. He was a protector, and his stillness was not weakness but strength, the coiled readiness of someone who could explode into action in an instant if the situation required. Months passed, and Daniel settled into his new life. He learned the rhythms of the palace, the comings and goings of staff and visitors, the particular concerns of each member of the royal family. He made friends among the other guards, men and women who shared his dedication and understood without words the weight of their responsibility. He sent letters home to his mother, describing the gardens and the architecture, the history that surrounded him every day, carefully avoiding anything that might worry her. Then, one morning, everything changed. Daniel had received a message that his mother was sick. Not just sick, but seriously ill. The doctors spoke of treatments and timelines of hope and preparation. Sarah had insisted that Daniel not come home, that he stay at his post, that she was fine. But Daniel could read between the lines of her letters, could hear the weariness in her voice during their brief phone calls. She was not fine. She was fighting as she had always fought, but this was a battle she might not win. Daniel had requested leave and been granted 2 weeks. He had packed quickly, his heart heavy, his mind already back in Millbrook, in that small house with the peeling paint, sitting beside his mother's bed. The flight home had been long, giving Daniel too much time to think. He thought about all the years he had been away, all the moments he had missed, all the conversations they had not had because there was always tomorrow, always later. He thought about how unfair it was that a woman who had given everything to her son, who had worked herself to the bone to give him a chance at a better life, should now face this battle without him by her side. When Daniel finally arrived in Millbrook, the town looked exactly the same and completely different. The streets were unchanged, but they seemed smaller. The buildings were familiar, but they felt distant, like memories rather than real places. He walked through town to his mother's house, carrying his bag, feeling eyes on him from windows and doorways. Word had spread that Sarah Morrison's boy was coming home. Sarah was waiting for him on the porch, wrapped in a blanket despite the warm weather. She had lost weight, her cheeks hollow, her skin pale, but her smile was exactly the same, lighting up her whole face when she saw her son coming up the walk. Daniel dropped his bag and took the porch steps 2 at a time, gathering his mother in his arms so gently, feeling how fragile she had become. She laughed and cried at the same time, patting his back, telling him he was too thin, asking if he was eating enough, being a mother in the way she had always been. That first night, they sat in the kitchen, Daniel at the same table where he had done his homework as a child, Sarah in her same chair, drinking tea that had gone cold because they were too busy talking to remember it. She asked about his life, his work, his friends. He told her about the palace, about the gardens in spring, about the tourists who tried to make him laugh. He made her laugh instead, imitating the faces people pulled, telling stories that painted his life as an adventure rather than the serious duty it was. But, as the days passed, the reality of Sarah's illness became impossible to ignore. She tired easily, needing to rest after climbing the stairs. She had little appetite, picking at food she had once devoured with enthusiasm. There were doctor's appointments, tests, discussions about treatment options. Daniel went to everyone, sitting beside his mother, holding her hand, asking questions the way he had been trained to assess situations and gather information. The prognosis was not good, but it was not hopeless. There were treatments available, medications, and procedures that could fight the disease by time, possibly even achieve remission. But these treatments were expensive, far more expensive than Sarah's savings could cover, far more than the insurance from the diner would pay. Daniel did not hesitate. He had money saved, years of living frugally while earning a good salary. He called his bank, began the process of transferring funds. He would pay for the treatments, every one of them, whatever it took. His mother had given him everything. Now it was his turn. The treatments began and, for a while, they seemed to be working. Sarah had more energy, more color in her cheeks. She started eating again, started talking about the future, about what she would do when she was better. Daniel allowed himself to hope, allowed himself to imagine years ahead with his mother, Christmases and birthdays and ordinary days that were precious simply because they existed. But stress has a way of finding outlets, and Daniel's stress found its outlet in sleepless nights and restless days. When he was not with his mother, he walked the town, trying to tire himself enough to sleep. He walked the streets he had known as a child, past the school where he had studied, the park where he had played, the church where his mother had taken him on Sundays. It was during one of these walks that Daniel first encountered Marcus Webb. It happened outside the diner where Sarah had worked for 20 years. Daniel had stopped to look at the familiar building, remembering all the times he had visited his mother there, sitting at the counter doing homework while she refilled coffee cups and charmed customers with her smile. The diner had changed ownership since then, but the neon sign still flickered the same way, and the smell of coffee still drifted through the door. A sports car screeched to a stop at the curb, and, for young men piled out, laughing too loud, their movements careless and confident. Daniel recognized the type immediately, rich kids who thought the world existed for their entertainment. He had met them in every country he had served, people who confused money with merit and power with worth. The leader was obviously the one with the expensive watch and the smirk that suggested he had never been told no. Marcus Webb, though Daniel did not know his name yet. Marcus looked at Daniel standing there, at his simple clothes and his military posture, and something flickered in his eyes. It was the look of a predator spotting potential prey. But Marcus did not approach. His friends called him, pointing at the diner door, eager for food and continued entertainment. Marcus gave Daniel one last look, a measuring look, then turned and followed his crew inside. Daniel watched them go, a feeling settling in his stomach that he recognized from his years of service. It was the feeling he got before something bad happened, the instinct that had saved his life more than once. He told himself he was being paranoid, that this was his hometown, that nothing was going to happen. But the feeling remained. Inside the diner, Marcus and his crew had taken over the largest booth, spreading out like they owned the place, which in a way they did since Marcus's father owned the building. They ordered food and drinks, but more than that, they ordered attention. Every word they spoke was loud. Every laugh was louder. Every gesture designed to make sure everyone in the diner was aware of their presence. The waitress was a young woman named Jenny, barely out of high school, working the late shift to save money for college. She smiled politely as she took their order, her pen moving quickly across her pad, her eyes carefully neutral. She had served Marcus before. She knew what he was like. When Jenny brought their food, Marcus reached out and grabbed her wrist. Not hard enough to hurt, but hard enough to make her stop, to remind her who was in charge. He looked up at her with that smirk, told her the coffee was cold, told her she should bring a fresh pot, told her she should smile more while she did it. Jenny's face went red, but she nodded and pulled away, hurrying back to the kitchen. Marcus's friends laughed, high-fiving each other like he had done something impressive rather than something cruel. From outside the window, Daniel watched. He saw the grab, saw the young woman's face, saw the laughter of the men in the booth. His hands clenched at his sides, but he forced himself to stay still. This was not his business. He was here for his mother, not to play hero. Starting trouble would only cause problems his mother did not need while she was trying to get well. But he memorized the face of the young man with the smirk. He noted the way the others followed his lead, the dynamic of the group, who was the leader and who were the followers. This was information gathering, the habit of a lifetime of training. He did not know yet how useful this information would be. Daniel turned and walked home, but the image of the young woman's frightened face stayed with him. In his experience, people like the smirking man did not stop at grabbed wrists and cold coffee. They escalated. They pushed and pushed until someone pushed back, and then they pushed harder because backing down would mean admitting they were not as powerful as they believed. A storm was coming to Millbrook. Daniel could feel it the way he had felt ambushes waiting in foreign lands. He did not know when it would break or how, but he knew it was coming. And when it came, he would be ready. The next morning, Daniel woke to the sound of his mother making breakfast. He lay in bed for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds, the sizzle of bacon, the clink of dishes, the soft humming of a song she had sung to him as a child. These sounds were precious, more precious than all the palace ceremonies and royal processions he had witnessed. These sounds were home. He got up and joined her in the kitchen, insisting she sit down while he finished cooking. She protested, of course, but he gave her that look, the one he had learned in the military, the one that said he was not asking. She laughed and sat, watching her son move around the kitchen with efficient grace. Over breakfast, Sarah told Daniel about her life in Millbrook, the years he had missed. She told him about neighbors who had moved away and new ones who had arrived, about scandals and romances, about births and deaths. It was the ordinary news of a small town, but to Daniel it was a history of his home, a connection to a place he had left behind. When his mother mentioned the Webb family, Daniel's ears perked up. She spoke carefully, the way everyone in town spoke about the Webbs, acknowledging their importance while hinting at darker truths. Richard Webb had built his empire, yes, but people whispered about the methods he had used, the competitors he had crushed, the rules he had bent. And his son, Marcus, was worse. Sarah did not go into details, but she did not need to. Daniel could fill in the blanks from what he had witnessed the night before. He asked his mother to be careful, to avoid any trouble involving the Webbs. She patted his hand and assured him she was too old and too tired for trouble. But trouble, Daniel knew, did not wait for invitation. It came when it chose, and all you could do was be ready to face it. The days settled into a routine. Daniel took his mother to her treatments, sitting in waiting rooms that smelled of antiseptic and fear, holding her hand while doctors spoke in careful language about progress and possibilities. He cooked for her, cleaned the house, fixed things that had broken while he was away. He tried to give her the care she had always given him. In his spare moments, Daniel explored the town he had left behind. He visited old haunts, surprised to find some unchanged and others transformed. He ran into people he had known in school, now grown with families of their own, children clinging to their legs, questions in their eyes about where he had been and what he had done. He answered vaguely, protecting both his privacy and theirs, not wanting to burden anyone with stories of distant conflicts and fallen friends. And occasionally he saw Marcus Webb. It seemed like everywhere Daniel went, Marcus was there or had just been there. At the grocery store, Daniel heard the clerks whispering about a scene Marcus had caused, berating an employee for not having his favorite brand of beer in stock. At the park, Daniel saw the aftermath of a party Marcus and his friends had thrown, trash scattered across the grass, the remains of a bonfire still smoldering dangerously close to the wooden playground. At the gas station, Danny, the former football player, recognized Daniel from high school and, after a few beers, told stories about the things Marcus did when he thought no one important was watching. A picture emerged of a young man who was not just spoiled but genuinely dangerous. Marcus did not just demand respect, he demanded submission. He did not just take what he wanted, he destroyed what he could not have. And his father's money protected him from every consequence, teaching him that the normal rules did not apply to people like him. Daniel listened and observed, saying little, storing information the way he had been trained. He did not want trouble. He wanted to help his mother heal and return to his post overseas. But the feeling in his stomach, that pre-storm sensation, grew stronger every day. 2 weeks into his leave, Daniel received news that made him have to extend his stay. His mother's treatments were working, but They needed more time, more sessions, more everything. The doctors were optimistic, but they cautioned against rushing, against cutting corners. This was a marathon, not a sprint. Daniel contacted his superiors, explaining the situation. They were understanding, granting him additional leave with the promise that his position would be waiting when he returned. He was grateful, relieved, and terrified all at once. More time with his mother was a gift. More time in Millbrook, with storm clouds gathering, was a risk. The storm broke on a Thursday evening. Daniel was walking home from the pharmacy, carrying his mother's medications in a paper bag. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, the kind of sunset that made even the tired streets of Millbrook look beautiful. Daniel was thinking about dinner, planning to make his mother's favorite soup, when he heard the sounds. Laughter first, the cruel kind that signals entertainment at someone else's expense. Then, a voice high and frightened, pleading. Then, the smack of flesh against flesh. Daniel moved without thinking, his body responding to the sounds of distress before his mind could catch up. He rounded the corner into an alley and found exactly what he had expected. Marcus Webb stood in the center of a loose circle formed by his friends. On the ground at his feet was a figure, curled up, trying to protect vital areas from the kicks that were landing. Daniel recognized the person on the ground, a young man from the neighborhood named Kevin, barely 18, known for being different, for loving art and poetry instead of sports, for walking with a slight sway that marked him as someone the bullies targeted. Marcus was not just kicking. He was laughing, performing for his friends, turning cruelty into entertainment. His foot pulled back for another blow, and Daniel had seen enough. The paper bag with the medications landed gently on a clean spot of pavement. Daniel did not remember putting it down, but his hands needed to be free. He stepped into the alley, his footsteps silent from years of practice, and spoke in a voice that cut through the laughter like a blade. What followed happened quickly. Marcus turned, surprised and then annoyed at the interruption. He did not recognize Daniel, did not know what he was facing. He saw only a stranger, someone who had no right to interfere, someone who would learn a painful lesson about minding his own business. Marcus said something insulting, something about Daniel's clothes or his posture or his nerve. His friends spread out, forming a wider circle, ready for a new show. Brett, the big one, cracked his knuckles with obvious anticipation. Daniel did not respond to the insult. He looked at Kevin, asked if he could stand, helped him to his feet when he nodded weakly. Then Daniel positioned himself between the injured young man and his attackers, a human shield made of training and determination. Marcus did not like being ignored. He pushed forward, reaching out to grab Daniel's shoulder, to spin him around, to teach him respect. What happened next would be talked about in Millbrook for years to come. Daniel moved with a speed that none of them expected. He did not strike first, that was important, he never struck first. But when Marcus's hand reached for him, Daniel redirected, turning the grab into a stumble, using Marcus's own momentum against him. The young man who had never faced real resistance found himself off balance, confused, his smirk replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Brett charged then, the big man thinking size would win as it always had. Daniel sidestepped, tripped, guided, and Brett went down hard, the breath leaving his body in a whoosh. Danny and Tyler exchanged looks, their confidence evaporating, uncertain whether to fight or flee. Marcus regained his footing, his face red with humiliation and rage. This was not supposed to happen. He was Marcus Webb. People did not do this to him. People did not make him look foolish in front of his friends. He swung a wild punch with all his weight behind it, the kind of punch that wins bar fights against drunk opponents. Daniel caught the fist, held it, looked into Marcus's eyes with an expression that conveyed everything words could not. The warning, the promise, the absolute certainty of what would happen if this continued. Then, Daniel released him, stepping back, giving Marcus a chance to walk away, to end this without further damage to anyone's pride or body. Marcus did not take the chance. He reached into his jacket, and everything changed. The glint of metal, A knife, because of course someone like Marcus would carry a knife, would escalate to weapons when his fists failed. His friends gasped, even they surprised by this turn, by how far their leader was willing to go. Daniel saw the knife and felt something shift inside him. This was no longer a schoolyard scuffle. This was combat. Real combat. The kind where people got hurt, got killed, got buried while their mothers cried. The training took over, not the military training but the Royal Guard training, the special protocols for dealing with armed attackers while protecting civilians. Daniel's priority was Kevin, still behind him, still vulnerable. His secondary priority was ending the threat without causing more harm than necessary. When Marcus lunged with the knife, Daniel was no longer there. The blade cut air, found nothing, and Daniel's hands moved in precise patterns that military manuals described but few could execute. The knife fell. A wrist was trapped, twisted, controlled. A body followed, guided to the ground with enough force to subdue but not enough to break. Marcus lay on the dirty alley floor, his arm locked in a hold that would dislocate his shoulder if he struggled. His face pressed against pavement that had witnessed countless indignities but never this one, never the great Marcus Webb brought low by a stranger in plain clothes. The others did not move. They stood frozen, witnesses to something they could not quite believe, something that would replay in their minds for years. Daniel spoke quietly, his words meant only for Marcus but heard by all. He spoke about respect, about consequences, about the difference between real power and the illusion of it. He spoke about what happened to bullies when they met someone who did not back down, who could not be bought or frightened or broken. Then, he released Marcus and stepped back, helping Kevin gather himself, asking if he needed medical attention, if he wanted Daniel to walk him home. Marcus rose slowly, his face a mask of hatred. He did not speak, did not threaten, did not promise revenge. But his eyes said everything. This was not over. This would never be over. Marcus Webb had been humiliated, and that was a debt he would collect with interest. Daniel walked Kevin home, the paper bag of medications retrieved, his mother's soup postponed. He listened as the young man thanked him, tears streaming down his face, words tumbling out about how the bullying had gone on for years, how no one had ever stood up for him, how he had started to believe he deserved it. Daniel told Kevin he deserved nothing of the sort. He told him that the world had cruel people, but it also had kind ones, and that surviving cruelty did not mean accepting it. He told him that things would change, somehow, someday, that they had to believe that or the cruelty won by default. At Kevin's door, the young man's mother emerged, alarmed by her son's condition, grateful beyond words for the stranger who had helped him. Daniel deflected her thanks, gave Kevin a final reassuring word, and continued home. His mother was waiting, worried about the late hour, relieved to see him safe. Daniel gave her the medications, made her soup, listened to her talk about her day, all while his mind churned with the implications of what had happened. He had made an enemy, not just Marcus but the entire Webb family and their considerable power. In a town where the Webbs owned everything, this was not a small thing. There would be consequences, pressures, attempts to drive him out or bring him down. But Daniel had faced worse enemies in worse places. He had stood guard while important people made important decisions, knowing that any moment could bring attack. He had learned to wait, to watch, to remain ready while appearing relaxed. Marcus Webb thought this was over. Marcus Webb thought he could regroup, plan, strike when Daniel least expected it. Marcus Webb was wrong. Daniel lay in his childhood bed that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to his mother's breathing through the thin walls. She was sleeping peacefully, unaware of the storm her son had walked into. He would protect her from it as long as he could, shield her from the worry that would only hinder her healing. But he knew, with the certainty of experience, that this was only the beginning. The real confrontation was yet to come. And when it came, someone was going to get hurt. Daniel hoped it would not be anyone he loved. But in his heart, he knew that hope alone was not enough. He would need every skill he had learned, every instinct he had developed, every ounce of the strength that had carried him through wars and wastelands. The bully had met his match. But the bully did not know it yet. and that Daniel thought asleep finally claimed him might be the only advantage he had. The morning after the alley confrontation, Marcus Webb woke with a bruise on his cheek and a fire in his chest that burned hotter than anything he had ever felt. He lay in his king-sized bed, surrounded by sheets that cost more than most people earned in a month, staring at the ceiling of his childhood bedroom in the Webb mansion. The room had everything money could buy: a 60-inch television, a gaming system with every title available, furniture handcrafted by Italian artisans, and windows that looked out over gardens maintained by a staff of 12. But none of it mattered this morning. This morning, Marcus could only think about the stranger who had humiliated him. The details of the previous night replayed in his mind like a nightmare that would not fade with waking. The way the man had moved so fast that Marcus could not track him. The way his knife, his beautiful knife with the pearl handle that his father had given him, had been taken away like a toy from a child. The way he had ended up on the ground, his face pressed into filth, his arm twisted behind his back in a hold that had made him whimper in front of his friends. His friends. The word tasted bitter now. Danny and Tyler had not even tried to help. They had stood there, useless and frozen, while Marcus was brought down by a single man. Brett, the supposed tough guy, had been handled just as easily. What was the point of having a crew if they could not protect him when it mattered? Marcus sat up slowly, his body aching in places he had never ached before. He examined his reflection in the mirror across the room and saw something he did not recognize. Weakness. His face was pale except for the bruise. His eyes were red from a sleepless night, and his expression held something that looked almost like fear. No, not fear. Marcus Webb did not feel fear. What he felt was anger, pure and righteous anger at the injustice of what had happened. He was the victim here, not the bully. He had been attacked without provocation, assaulted by a dangerous stranger who had no business interfering in private matters. The fact that Kevin had been cowering on the ground when the stranger arrived was irrelevant. Kevin deserved what he got. Kevin always had it coming with his weird clothes and his poetry and his refusal to act like a normal person. But the stranger, who was he? Where had he come from? How had he learned to fight like that? Marcus grabbed his phone and started making calls. The first call was to Danny, who answered with a voice thick with hangover and shame. Marcus demanded information, anything Danny knew or could find out about the stranger. Danny promised to ask around, to visit the gas station gossips, to do whatever it took to make up for his failure the night before. The second call was to Brett, who answered with less shame and more anger. Brett was not used to being dropped so easily. He had been in real fights, had spent time in jail for sending men to the hospital. The stranger had made him look like an amateur, and Brett wanted payback almost as much as Marcus did. He promised to reach out to some contacts, people who might be able to identify someone with those kinds of skills. The third call was to Tyler, who did not answer at first, then called back 5 minutes later with breathless apologies. Tyler had no connections, no ideas, no value whatsoever, but he assured Marcus of his total loyalty and his willingness to do whatever was asked. The fourth call was the one that mattered. Richard Webb answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and impatient. He was a busy man, always working, always building, always expanding his empire. His son's calls usually meant problems, and Richard did not have time for problems this morning. Marcus told his father about the incident, carefully editing the narrative to cast himself as the victim. He had been walking home, minding his own business, when a violent stranger had attacked him without warning. The stranger had beaten him, threatened him, held a knife to his throat. It was assault, possibly attempted murder. Something had to be done. Richard listened in silence. He had raised Marcus, had watched him grow from a spoiled child into a spoiled man, and he knew how to read between the lines of his son's stories. The truth was probably something different, something that involved Marcus starting trouble and finding more than he could handle. But that did not matter. What mattered was that someone had touched his son, had hurt his son, had challenged the Webb family's dominance in a town that belonged to them. Richard asked for a description of the stranger, and Marcus provided what he could remember, which was not much. Medium height, athletic build, brown hair, calm eyes that had looked at Marcus like he was nothing, less than nothing, a pest to be dealt with and forgotten. Richard promised to look into it. He had resources that his son did not, contacts in the police department, the county government, the business community. If the stranger was anyone of significance, Richard would find out. And once he knew who he was dealing with, he would take appropriate action. Marcus felt slightly better after the call. His father would fix this. His father always fixed things. That was what money was for, after all, to solve problems, to crush obstacles, to ensure that people like the Webbs never had to accept outcomes they did not like. But as the hours passed, Marcus's confidence began to waver. His father had not called back. Danny's inquiries had produced nothing useful, just rumors and speculation. Brett's contacts were unreachable or unhelpful. The stranger remained a mystery, and mysteries were dangerous. That afternoon, Marcus drove through town in his sports car, slower than usual, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of the man who had humiliated him. He wanted to see him again, wanted to prove that last night had been a fluke, a momentary advantage that would not be repeated. He fantasized about confrontations, about clever words and decisive actions, about emerging victorious and validated. He did not find the stranger. What he found instead was the talk. Millbrook was a small town, and small towns love to gossip. Word of the alley incident had spread overnight, growing and changing with each retelling until it had become something legendary. The story that circulated was not Marcus's version, but something closer to the truth. A tale of a bully brought low by a mysterious defender who had appeared from nowhere and vanished just as quickly. Marcus heard the whispers when he stopped at the coffee shop. The baristas exchanged looks, their smiles a little too bright, their service a little too slow. He heard the snickers when he walked into the sporting goods store, the staff suddenly busy with inventory that had not needed attention 5 minutes before. He saw the glances, the pointed fingers, the shaking heads. For the first time in his life, Marcus Webb was a joke. The rage that had been simmering since morning began to boil. These people, these nobodies who depended on his family for their livelihoods, were laughing at him. They were enjoying his humiliation, savoring it like a fine wine. After everything the Webbs had done for this pathetic town, after all the jobs and investments and charitable donations, this was how they repaid him. Marcus drove home and locked himself in his room, ignoring calls from Danny and Tyler, refusing to eat the dinner his mother had the cook prepare. He sat in darkness, feeding his anger, nurturing his hatred, planning his revenge. The stranger would pay. The town would pay. Everyone who had laughed, everyone who had enjoyed his downfall, everyone who had failed to show proper respect, they would all pay. Marcus did not know how yet, but he would figure it out. He always did. 3 days later, Richard Webb finally called his son with information. The stranger's name was Daniel Morrison. He was the son of Sarah Morrison, a waitress who had worked at the diner for decades before falling ill. He had left Millbrook years ago to join the military, had served overseas, and now worked in some kind of security position. He was back in town temporarily to help his sick mother. Richard's voice carried a note of warning as he shared this information. Daniel Morrison was not someone to trifle with. He had military training, combat experience, and the kind of calm competence that suggested he could back up whatever promises he made. The smart move would be to let this go, to consider the incident a learning experience, to avoid any further confrontation. Marcus listened to his father's advice and immediately decided to ignore it. His father did not understand. This was not about smart moves or practical considerations. This was about pride, about reputation, about proving that Marcus Webb was not someone who could be pushed around. If he let this go, if he accepted the humiliation and moved on, he would be sending a message to everyone in town that he was weak. And once people thought you were weak, they never stopped thinking it. No, Marcus decided. The confrontation would continue. Daniel Morrison would learn what happened to people who crossed the Webb family. And this time Marcus would be prepared. The plan came together over the following week. Marcus gathered his crew, not just Danny and Tyler and Brett, but others as well. He called in favors, made promises, offered money to people who could be bought, which was most people. By the end of the week, he had assembled a small army of men willing to do what needed to be done in exchange for cash or future considerations. The plan was simple. They would catch Daniel Morrison alone, somewhere private, away from witnesses. They would teach him a lesson he would never forget, break some bones, leave some scars, send a message that would be heard throughout the county. And, if things went too far, if the lesson became permanent, well, the Webb family had lawyers and connections that could make problems disappear. Marcus did not think about what his father would say. He did not think about consequences or morality or the look in Daniel Morrison's eyes, that calm certainty that suggested he had faced worse than anything Millbrook could offer. Marcus thought only about revenge, about vindication, about restoring his rightful place at the top of the social order. The opportunity came on a Saturday evening. Marcus had people watching Daniel, following him, tracking his movements. They reported that he had developed a routine, walking to the pharmacy every few days to pick up his mother's medications, then walking home through the same streets at the same time. He was predictable, which meant he was vulnerable. That Saturday, Marcus positioned his crew along Daniel's expected route. Some waited in cars, ready to block escape routes. Others lingered on foot, pretending to be pedestrians, ready to converge when the signal was given. Brett led a group hiding in an alley, the same alley where the original confrontation had occurred, because Marcus had a sense of poetic justice. Marcus himself waited in his car, parked where he could see the pharmacy entrance. He would watch Daniel emerge, would follow him to the ambush point, would be there to deliver the final words before the beating began. He had practiced what he would say, had rehearsed the speech in his mirror, imagining Daniel's face as he realized how badly he had miscalculated. The pharmacy door opened, and Daniel Morrison walked out. Marcus felt a surge of adrenaline as he watched his enemy. Daniel moved with that same effortless grace, that same quiet alertness that had been so devastating in their first encounter. But this time would be different. This time Marcus had numbers on his side. This time Daniel would not be facing one spoiled rich kid and his useless friends. He would be facing a dozen men who had been promised good money to cause serious harm. Daniel started walking, following his usual route, unaware of the trap closing around him. Marcus started his car and began to follow. What Marcus did not know, could not have known, was that Daniel Morrison had not survived years of military service by being careless. From the moment he had returned to Millbrook, Daniel had been aware of the danger the Webb family represented. He had noticed the people watching his mother's house, had spotted the cars that followed him a little too closely, had sensed the gathering storm long before it broke. Daniel had allowed himself to be watched, had established the predictable routine that made him seem vulnerable, had walked the same streets at the same time specifically because he knew an attack was coming and he wanted it to come on his terms. Now, as he walked toward the pharmacy with the paper bag of medications, he knew that tonight was the night. He could feel the watcher's attention sharpening, could sense the tension in the air, could practically hear the whispered communications of people coordinating his demise. Good. Daniel had prepared for this moment. He had scouted the terrain, identified the likely ambush points, planned his responses to various scenarios. He had considered going to the police, but he knew how that would end in a town where the Webbs owned everything and everyone. He had considered leaving town entirely, taking his mother somewhere safe, but she was too sick to travel and her treatments were here. He had considered calling his old unit, asking for backup, but this was his fight, his town, his problem to solve. So he had done what soldiers do when they cannot avoid a fight. He had prepared to win it. As Daniel passed the alley where he knew Brett and others were waiting, he adjusted his pace slightly, positioning himself exactly where he wanted to be. He heard the rustle of movement behind him, the scrape of shoes on pavement, the quickened breathing of men about to attack. They came from all sides, emerging from alleys and doorways and parked cars, forming a loose circle that tightened with each step. Daniel counted them as they appeared, 12 men, most of them younger and stronger than the friends Marcus had brought to the first confrontation. These were not kids playing at being tough. These were adults who had been paid to hurt him. The circle closed, and Marcus's sports car pulled up at the curb. The door opened, and Marcus stepped out, his face twisted with triumphant hatred. This was the moment Marcus had dreamed about for weeks. Daniel Morrison, surrounded, outnumbered, helpless. The reversal of fortune that would erase the shame of that night in the alley. The proof that Marcus Webb always won in the end. Marcus walked toward Daniel, leaving his car running, wanting to savor every second of this victory. His crew parted to let him through, closing again behind him a wall of muscle and malice. Daniel stood in the center of the circle, his posture relaxed, his face calm. He looked at Marcus with an expression that was almost pitying, like a teacher watching a student make a predictable mistake. Marcus stopped a few feet away, close enough to touch, close enough to hit if he wanted to throw the first punch. He opened his mouth to deliver the speech he had practiced, the words that would punctuate his victory and precede the violence. What came out was not a speech. What came out was a scream. Daniel moved with speed that defied comprehension. In the time it took Marcus to blink, Daniel had crossed the distance between them, had grabbed Marcus's shirt, had spun him around and locked an arm across his throat. Marcus found himself being used as a human shield, his back pressed against Daniel's chest, his airway partially restricted, his arms pinned uselessly at his sides. The crew froze, suddenly, uncertain. They had expected an easy target, a man who would cower and beg when faced with superior numbers. Instead, they faced a hostage situation, their boss held captive by the very person they had come to destroy. Daniel spoke, his voice calm and conversational despite the violence of his hold. He addressed the crew, not Marcus, recognizing that the hired muscles were the immediate threat while their employer was merely the architect of this disaster. He explained in simple terms what would happen next. Anyone who attacked would have to go through Marcus first. Any weapon raised would result in Marcus suffering the consequences. Any attempt to rush him would end with Marcus's neck being snapped like a twig. To emphasize his point, Daniel tightened his arm slightly, and Marcus made a choking sound that echoed in the silence. The crew exchanged uncertain glances. They had been paid to beat a man, not to participate in what might become a murder. Their calculations shifted, weighing the promised money against the risk of being accessories to something far more serious. One by one, their aggressive postures softened, their clenched fists relaxed, their forward momentum ceased. Daniel noticed the shift and pressed his advantage. He addressed Brett specifically, recognizing the big man as the most dangerous of the group. He told Brett that this did not need to go further, that everyone could walk away tonight with their dignity and their health intact. All they had to do was leave. Leave and not come back. Leave and pretend this night had never happened. Brett stared at Daniel for a long moment, sizing him up, calculating odds that did not look favorable. Then, slowly he nodded. He turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. After a moment, others followed, peeling off from the circle one by one, until only Danny and Tyler remained, too loyal or too stupid to abandon their leader. Daniel released Marcus with a shove that sent him stumbling forward. Marcus caught himself, gasping for air, his face red and his eyes wild. He spun to face Daniel, ready to attack, but something in Daniel's expression stopped him. Daniel spoke directly to Marcus now, his voice low and intense. He told Marcus that this was over. Not temporarily over, not paused for strategic regrouping, but finished. If Marcus came after him again, Daniel would respond with everything he had. And everything he had, Daniel made clear, was considerable. Daniel had friends, he explained. Not friends like Danny and Tyler who ran at the first sign of real trouble. Real friends, brothers who had fought beside him in places Marcus could not pronounce, who would come if called, who would protect Daniel's mother if anything happened to Daniel himself. These friends did not operate by Millbrook's rules. They did not care about the Webb family's money or connections. They cared only about loyalty, and their loyalty to Daniel was absolute. Marcus listened, and For the first time in his life he felt genuine fear. Not the momentary alarm of the first confrontation, but a deep, persistent terror that settled into his bones and would not leave. He was facing something beyond his experience, something that money could not buy and power could not intimidate. He was facing a man who had nothing to lose and nothing to fear, a man who would die before backing down. Daniel waited for the fear to sink in, then continued. He gave Marcus a choice. The first option was to walk away, to accept that the universe had handed him a defeat and move on. The second option was to continue the feud, to keep coming after Daniel, to escalate until someone got seriously hurt or killed. If Marcus chose the second option, Daniel promised he would not be the one who got hurt. Marcus might have money and men, but Daniel had skills and experience that made numbers irrelevant. Daniel had faced enemies far more dangerous than a spoiled rich kid with daddy issues, and he had won. He would win this too, no matter how long it took or what it cost. The choice, Daniel concluded, was Marcus's. He hoped Marcus would choose wisely. Then, Daniel turned his back on Marcus and walked away. It was the most insulting thing he could have done. In military terms, it was a declaration of contempt, a statement that Marcus was so little a threat that Daniel did not even need to watch him. It was also a test, a way of seeing whether Marcus had learned anything from tonight's lesson. Marcus stood frozen, watching Daniel's retreating back. His fists clenched at his sides, his jaw tight with impotent rage. Danny and Tyler watched him, waiting for a signal, ready to act if ordered. But the order never came. Something had broken inside Marcus Webb tonight. Not his pride, that would heal eventually, fed by money and privilege and the short memories of those who depended on him. What had broken was his certainty, his absolute conviction that he could do anything and face no consequences. For the first time in his life, Marcus had met someone who could not be bought, could not be threatened, could not be defeated by the weapons Marcus had always relied upon. And that someone had looked at Marcus like he was nothing, less than nothing, a nuisance to be dealt with and forgotten. Marcus turned and walked to his car, ignoring the questioning looks from Danny and Tyler. He got behind the wheel, started the engine, and drove away without a word. That night, Marcus Webb learned a lesson that his father's money could never have taught him. He learned that real power had nothing to do with wealth or status or the number of men you could hire. Real power came from within, from the quiet certainty of someone who knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. Daniel Morrison had that power. Marcus Webb did not. The realization burned like acid, but underneath the burning, something else began to grow. Not respect, exactly, not admiration, but something that might eventually become wisdom if Marcus allowed it. He was not ready to allow it. Not yet. The wounds were too fresh, the humiliation too complete. But somewhere deep inside, in a place Marcus rarely visited, a seed had been planted. Change was possible. Growth was possible. Becoming something better than what he was might even be possible. But first, Marcus had to survive the conversation waiting for him at home. Richard Webb was sitting in the study when Marcus arrived, his face unreadable, his fingers steepled in front of his chin. He had received phone calls, had heard reports, had pieced together what had happened. He knew about the ambush, the crew, the plan that his son had hatched without consulting him. He knew about the spectacular failure, the disintegration of the attack, the retreat that had followed. Marcus tried to speak, to explain, to justify, but his father raised a hand for silence. Richard spoke for a long time that night. He spoke about the family business, about the relationships and reputations that had taken decades to build. He spoke about the police contacts who were asking questions, the newspaper editor who was sniffing around for a story, the town council members who were suddenly less cooperative than they had been before. Marcus's little vendetta, Richard explained, had cost the family. Not money, money could be replaced, but something more valuable. It had cost them fear. For years, people in Millbrook had feared the Webbs, had cooperated not out of love but out of awareness of what happened to those who did not cooperate. Now, thanks to Marcus's public humiliations, that fear was fading. People were starting to wonder if the webs were really as powerful as they had always seemed. They were starting to question, to push back, to imagine alternatives. One man had stood up to Marcus and won not once but twice. If he could do it, maybe others could too. Maybe the Webb family's grip on Millbrook was not as unbreakable as everyone had assumed. Richard's voice remained calm throughout, but Marcus could hear the anger underneath. His father was not just disappointed. His father was furious, the cold fury of a man who had built something valuable and watched his son put it at risk. When Richard finished speaking, he delivered his judgment. Marcus was cut off. No more allowance, no more credit cards, no more access to the family accounts. He would have to get a job, would have to learn what it meant to earn a living instead of inheriting one. The sports car would be sold. The late nights and the parties and the crew of hangers-on would end. Marcus opened his mouth to protest, but the look in his father's eyes silenced him. This was not negotiable. This was not the beginning of a conversation. This was a sentence being handed down, and Marcus would serve it or face even worse consequences. That night, alone in his room with the entertainment systems disconnected and the designer clothes destined for donation, Marcus faced the wreckage of his life. He had lost everything that had defined him, everything that had made him special, everything that had separated him from the ordinary people he had always despised. He was nobody now, just another young man in a small town, with nothing to offer except a famous last name that had become more liability than asset. And it was all because of Daniel Morrison. The hatred flared again, hot and bright, and for a moment Marcus entertained fantasies of revenge. He would find a way to get back at the man who had destroyed him. He would wait and plan and strike when the time was right. He would prove that Marcus Webb could not be beaten, not permanently, not by anyone. But even as the fantasies played out in his mind, another voice whispered doubts. What had revenge gotten him so far? 2 public humiliations, a severed relationship with his father, and the complete destruction of his comfortable life. Every attempt to strike at Daniel had resulted in Marcus being struck harder. Every escalation had backfired catastrophically. Maybe, the doubting voice suggested, there was another way. Maybe the problem was not Daniel Morrison at all. Maybe the problem was Marcus himself, the person he had become, the choices he had made, the values he had embraced. Marcus pushed the thought away, but it would not stay pushed. It kept returning, a persistent whisper that would not be silenced. That night, for the first time in his life, Marcus Webb cried. He cried for his lost privileges and his shattered pride. He cried for his father's disappointment and his mother's worried looks. He cried for the person he might have been if he had made different choices, if he had learned different lessons, if he had become something other than what he was. And somewhere in the tears, hidden beneath layers of anger and fear and denial, something new began to stir. It was small and fragile and easily crushed, but it was there, waiting to grow if Marcus would let it. The story was far from over, but for the first time, there was a possibility that it might end differently than anyone expected. Across town, in a small house with peeling paint, Daniel Morrison sat beside his mother's bed, holding her hand while she slept. Sarah's treatments were progressing, the doctors more optimistic with each visit. There was talk of remission, of recovery, of years ahead that had seemed impossible just weeks before. Daniel did not tell his mother about the confrontations with Marcus Webb. She did not need that worry. Not now. Not when she was fighting the most important battle of her life. He told her instead about the flowers in the neighbors' gardens, about the children playing in the streets, about the ordinary beauty of the town she had called home for so long. But even as he spoke of peaceful things, Daniel remained alert. He knew that Marcus Webb was not finished, might never be finished. Men like that did not accept defeat gracefully. They nursed their grievances, waited for opportunities, struck when you least expected it. Daniel would be ready. He always was. But tonight, with his mother sleeping peacefully and the medication working and hope finally seeming reasonable, Daniel allowed himself a moment of peace. He had come home to protect the woman who had given him everything. He was doing that. Whatever else happened, whatever storms still waited to break, He was doing what he had come to do. And that, for now, was enough. The moonlight streamed through the window, painting silver patterns on the floor. Somewhere outside, a dog barked and, then, fell silent. The town of Millbrook slept, unaware of the dramas that had played out in its streets, the confrontations that had shifted the balance of power in ways that would only become clear with time. Two young men lay awake in the darkness, one in a mansion and one in a cottage, both thinking about the other, both wondering what would come next. They were connected now, bound by conflict and consequence, their fates intertwined in ways neither could have predicted. The story would continue. It always did. But, for now, in the quiet of the night, there was peace. It would not last. Peace never did. But while it was there, it was enough. The weeks that followed the failed ambush brought changes to Millbrook that no one had anticipated. The story of Daniel Morrison, the mysterious defender who had twice humiliated the town's most privileged son, spread beyond whispered gossip and became something approaching legend. People who had never met Daniel spoke of him with admiration. Children reenacted his confrontations in schoolyard games, pretending to be the hero who stood against bullies. Shop owners who had lived in fear of the Webb family's displeasure began to straighten their spines, to speak their minds, to imagine a different kind of town. For Daniel, these weeks were focused on simpler things. His mother's health continued to improve, the treatments working better than the doctors had hoped, color returning to her cheeks and strength returning to her body. Sarah Morrison, who had spent her life caring for others, finally allowed herself to be cared for, and the experience transformed her in ways she had not expected. She laughed more, worried less, spoke about the future with an optimism that had been absent for too long. Daniel found himself settling into a rhythm. Mornings began with breakfast prepared for his mother, careful attention to her medications and appointments, conversations that ranged from practical to philosophical. Afternoons were spent on the house, fixing things that had deteriorated during his absence, painting walls and repairing fences and making the small cottage feel like home again. Evenings belonged to walks through the town, visits with old friends and new acquaintances, the gradual rebuilding of connections that had frayed during his years away. The walks were not entirely peaceful. Daniel remained alert, his training making it impossible to move through the world without awareness of potential threats. He noticed when cars slowed as they passed him, when strangers watched him a moment too long, when the normal patterns of the street shifted in ways that might indicate surveillance. But the weeks passed without incident. Marcus Webb, it seemed, had finally learned his lesson. Or so Daniel hoped. The truth was more complicated. Marcus had indeed retreated, but retreat was not surrender. His father's punishment had stripped him of the resources he had always relied upon, forcing him to confront a world where his name and his money meant nothing. He had taken a job at the lumber mill, the same mill his family owned, starting at the bottom like any other new hire. He hauled wood and cleaned equipment and listened to supervisors who had once deferred to his every whim. The work was brutal. Marcus's hands, soft from years of luxury, blistered and bled. His back ached from lifting loads he had never imagined carrying. His pride burned daily, each order from a superior a reminder of how far he had fallen. The other workers watched him with barely concealed satisfaction, enjoying the spectacle of the mighty Webb heir reduced to manual labor. But something unexpected happened during those brutal weeks. As Marcus's body hardened to the work, his perspective began to shift. He saw things he had never noticed before, the quiet dignity of men who worked hard for modest wages, the camaraderie that formed between people who shared difficult tasks, the satisfaction that came from completing a job well done. These were alien concepts to someone who had always had everything handed to him, but slowly, reluctantly, Marcus began to understand them. One afternoon, exhausted and covered in sawdust, Marcus sat in the break room with a cup of coffee that tasted better than anything he had ever drunk in expensive restaurants. An older worker named Frank sat down across from him, studied him for a moment, then spoke. Frank had worked at the mill for 30 years, had known Marcus's father when Richard was just another laborer dreaming of bigger things. He had watched the family rise, had seen the changes that money brought, had kept his opinions to himself because keeping opinions to yourself was how you survived in a town dominated by a single family. But now, with Marcus stripped of his protections, Frank felt free to speak honestly. He told Marcus about his father, the young Richard Webb who had worked harder than anyone Frank had ever seen, who had treated his co-workers with respect, who had dreamed not just of wealth but of building something that mattered. That Richard Webb had been someone Frank admired, someone worth following. The Richard Webb of today was different. The Marcus Webb of before was worse. Frank did not soften his words. He told Marcus exactly what the town thought of him, the fear and resentment his cruelty had inspired, the relief people felt when Daniel Morrison had finally shown him that he was not untouchable. Marcus listened without interrupting. A month ago, he would have exploded at such disrespect, would have threatened Frank's job, would have made him pay for every honest word. But something had changed. The explosions did not come as easily now. The threats felt hollow. Instead, Marcus simply listened, and, in listening, heard things that transformed him. Frank finished by saying something that would stay with Marcus for the rest of his life. He said that a man's character was not determined by his worst moments but by what he did afterward. Marcus had been a bully and a coward, had used his family's power to hurt people who could not fight back. That was the past. The question was what Marcus would do with the future. Then, Frank stood up, returned to work, and left Marcus alone with thoughts that would not settle. That evening, Marcus did something he had never done before. He walked through the neighborhoods on the wrong side of town, the streets where the workers lived, the houses that his family's wealth made possible but that he had never bothered to see. He saw the pride with which people maintained their small properties, the gardens tended with care, the children playing in yards that were modest but clean. He saw a community that existed independently of his family's influence, people who had built lives of meaning without the advantages he had always taken for granted. He found himself standing in front of Daniel Morrison's house. The cottage was small, smaller than Marcus's bedroom had been, but flowers bloomed in window boxes and the porch had been recently painted. Through a lit window, Marcus could see Daniel and his mother sitting at a kitchen table, talking and laughing, sharing a moment of ordinary happiness that Marcus had never experienced with his own family. He stood there for a long time, watching, thinking about the paths that had brought them to this moment. Two young men, the same age, raised in the same town, who had become enemies because Marcus had never learned to be anything else. What would have happened if things had been different? If Marcus had grown up in a house like that, with a mother who worked double shifts and a father who had disappeared, would he have become someone worth admiring? If Daniel had been born into wealth and privilege, would he have become a bully like Marcus? The questions had no answers, but they lingered, reshaping Marcus's understanding of himself and the world. He walked home slowly, seeing the town with new eyes. The streets he had driven through 100 times, too fast, too carelessly, revealed themselves as places where real people lived real lives. The shops his family owned were not just properties but livelihoods, the work that put food on tables and hopes in hearts. The town was not his playground. It was a community and he had been its tormentor. The shame that washed over Marcus was unlike anything he had felt before. It was not the hot embarrassment of public humiliation but something deeper, a cold recognition of who he had been and what he had done. He had hurt people, not just Daniel Morrison but Kevin and Jenny and countless others whose names he had never bothered to learn. He had made their lives worse simply because he could, because it entertained him, because no one had ever stopped him. Someone had stopped him now. And in stopping him, Daniel Morrison had given Marcus a gift he did not deserve and would never have asked for. The gift was a chance to become someone different. Marcus did not sleep that night. He lay in his room, no longer filled with expensive things, and thought about what he wanted his life to be. For the first time, he asked not what he could take but what he could give. Not who he could hurt but who he could help. Not how he could prove his importance but how he could become someone actually worth respecting. The answers did not come easily. Years of selfishness had left Marcus without the tools for genuine reflection. But the questions themselves were a start, and Marcus held onto them like a drowning man holds onto driftwood. The next morning, Marcus went to work at the mill as usual. But his demeanor was different. He worked harder, complained less, and, when opportunities arose to help co-workers with their tasks, he took them without expecting anything in return. The other workers noticed the change, exchanged puzzled glances, wondered if it was some trick or manipulation. Marcus understood their suspicion. He had given them no reason to trust him. Building that trust would take time, effort, and consistency. He had never been consistent about anything in his life. This would be his first attempt. Days turned into weeks, and Marcus's transformation continued, slowly, imperfectly, but genuinely. He apologized to Jenny, the waitress he had grabbed at the diner. A stumbling apology that she received with skepticism but acknowledged with a nod. He sought out Kevin, the young man he had beaten in the alley, and offered not just apology but practical help, using his family's connections to secure Kevin an internship at an art gallery in the city. Kevin did not forgive Marcus immediately. Forgiveness was not owed, but he accepted the help and wondered if people really could change. Word of these gestures spread through Millbrook, adding new chapters to the legend that was still being written. The story of Daniel Morrison and Marcus Webb was no longer just a tale of confrontation and defeat. It was becoming something more complex, a narrative about consequences and choices and the possibility of redemption. Daniel heard the stories and did not know what to make of them. His instincts, honed by years of watching enemies regroup and strike when least expected, warned him not to trust this apparent transformation. People like Marcus did not change. They adapted, they manipulated, they found new ways to achieve old goals. This show of remorse could be nothing more than strategy, a long game designed to lower Daniel's guard before the final attack. But another part of Daniel, the part that had survived not through suspicion but through hope, suggested a different possibility. Perhaps Marcus was genuinely changing. Perhaps the confrontations had broken through something, had shattered the armor of entitlement that had protected Marcus from self-knowledge. Perhaps, against all odds, something good was coming from the conflict that had nearly destroyed them both. Daniel decided to wait and watch. He would not seek Marcus out, would not extend an olive branch that might be slapped away. But he would also not refuse peace if it was genuinely offered. Too many years of war had taught him the value of peace.